Good evening, everyone. On behalf of the Institute for Environment and Sustainability, welcome to the Lim Tian-Sing Lecture Series. This event is made possible by the generous endowed gift from Mr. Lim Tian-Sing to the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, National University of Singapore. Mr. Lim is the founder of the Chip Ink Sing Corporation Limited, and over the years, he has played an instrumental role in the group's journey from a sole proprietorship into one of the leading main contractors and property developers in Singapore today. Now, it's a real pleasure for me to introduce our speaker today, Professor Michael Hanemann. And this is a pleasure not just professionally, but personally as well. Like many in this room, I first encountered Michael's work as a graduate student. His papers on environmental valuation and welfare economics were not just things we read for class. They were foundational work that shaped how we think about environmental policies. Now, his papers were not easy to understand, and I remember struggling through them. But, after spending many hours, we realized that, how powerful and elegant his ideas were. I later had the opportunity to spend a semester at Arizona State University, where I got to interact with Michael. They say, never meet your hero, but that's not the case with Michael. After spending time with him, we realized that what impressed me was not just the depth of his scholarship, but also his generosity and humbleness. I remember one episode, it was in the last few days before I was scheduled to leave Arizona. And I finally plucked out the courage to see a consultation with Michael. My dissertation was on air pollution, but Michael works mostly on water. But yet, Michael spent time, to patiently walk me through, some of the issues I had with my idea, my dissertation, and those, the encounter really helped me in shaping my dissertation. And, without exaggeration, Professor Hanemann is one of the most influential figures in environmental economics. But not only that, he is also one of the rare scholars whose work commands respect across different intellectual and policy communities, from rigorous academic economists to policymakers and practitioners. Michael's views are highly respected and sought after, and we are extremely fortunate to have him with us today. I'm very much looking forward to his talk and learning from his insights. Please join me in welcoming Professor Michael Hanemann.
It's a very great pleasure for me to be here. It's an honor to be invited by the School of Public Policy. And it's, as I said, an enormous pleasure for several reasons. I have known of the water research conducted here for a long time. My good friend Dale Whittington has spent time here and worked here, and I've always envied him and always wanted to be able to come here and visit you. Also, the last 2 days have been quite remarkable as a workshop on the notion of water credits. They've been remarkable because I've learned things and they've opened my eyes and they've given me a sense of a different world. I'm going to say, I'll mention in a moment, I come from the old world. I come from England, but I've spent my career in the United States. And in terms of water, the United States is the old world. It has a set of institutions inherited from England when it was a colony, which are massively counterproductive. But for understandable reasons, which I'm going to describe. And what is so inspiring from yesterday's conference is the realization, which is obvious once you know of it, but I hadn't really seen it that way, of how some countries have been able to escape from the past. Singapore is a notable example. In water, Australia is another example. So my talk and a lot of my reflection is on how things don't work in America with water and elsewhere. And they're the victim of history. And the key thing is somehow to escape history. And Singapore has done that, or at least it's escaped a chunk of its history, and it's creating a new history. But in a sense, I think this is the ultimate challenge of water. Now, let me resume this theme in a moment, but let me just start out by saying something about the context for my talk. So the economics of water was a hot topic in the 1950s and 60s in American universities, and especially in Berkeley, where I came in 1976 to be a professor. Berkeley was one of the places which had most of the economists and published most. That field dwindled in the 1970s. Energy, the economics of energy, was the hot topic. I was unwise enough to go into the field of water, not into the field of energy. I have been lucky to hang around for long enough, so I'm now becoming contemporary because water is beginning to undergo a revival. I'll mention one personal anecdote. My department in Berkeley, the Department of Agricultural Economics, had a wonderful library of material on water. Not just books, but reports, documents going back to the 1930s. They were housed in maybe 40 or 50 four-drawer file cabinets. We had our own library, run by very tough librarians. You had to fill out a form, and then they would bring the book to you. As a faculty member, I had a key to the library. When the library closed at 5 or 6 o'clock, I roamed the library. I spent several weeks, nights, going through all of the file cabinets and discovering what was really a superb library on the economics of water. And in a way, that's how I learned much of the economics of water, going through the library, and then in the next morning submitting a request for the items I had been looking at the night before. The library exists no more. It was thrown out about 6 years ago because they wanted to use the space for something else. And that history, in a way, reflects what happened to water. But the point is, water is now getting reborn in America. PhD students in economics are writing dissertations. It's becoming a field again, and that's wonderful. The problem is that many of these students, and in fact their professors, don't know the institutions of water and the physical facts of water. And what they're doing is building on the extensive literature on energy, and especially electricity, supply and demand, and applying the methods of analysis to water. And unfortunately, that is a fundamental error, because water is fundamentally different, as I'm going to argue. And so what I'm wanting to do now, what I'm working on now, is writing a textbook on the economics of water, which explains why water is different and why those differences have economic consequences. And that's the theme for what I want to talk about today. Let me say, I realize this is misplaced to some extent, because I think here at NUS, you know that. You know the things I'm saying. I'm really talking to my colleagues in America, in England, in France, and Germany, who I think don't know this. I also think that there are lots of people who are not economists who are interested in water, who see anomalies or weird or puzzling things And these things have an explanation which lies in the economics, but that's not laid out for them by economists. And so that's something I want to try and explain to non-economists. But I have to say, all I know is England, bits of Western Europe, America, Spain. And one of the joys of the conference for these 2 days is really getting a sense of the exciting things happening in Southeast Asia, in Singapore, in this region. The other thing is some of you are water managers or work. I'm an academic. I've kind of been a fly on the wall looking at things. So my knowledge is limited. The key point I want to emphasize is water is problematic and difficult. And water scarcity and the difficulty of making water available to human societies is endemic to human societies across history and also across space. The story of water is really the story of humanity. Now, economists, certainly not American economists, don't think in those terms. They think you have a sound training in economic theory, you do 2 years of graduate coursework, which is mainly theorems and mathematics, and you understand life in the world. And what I realize is, no, you have to look at other countries, you have to look at history, ancient history, because they faced the same problems that we face today with water. The solutions, the technology was different, but to study water, even as an economist, or I should say especially as an economist, you need to be holistic. And one of the essences which I want to attack is the notion of economists that you need to get the price right. With anything, if the price is set right, everybody will live happily ever after. It's like God creating the world. If you get the price right, you can rest. You only need half a day. You don't need, multiple days. You get the price right, everything else follows. And that's because in theory, that's true. It's not true, and it's especially not true with water. Now, there are two crucial facts about water which are obvious to anybody and to everybody. It's essential for human life, and it's not made by man. It's produced by nature. And nature, carelessly, if you like, distributes water spottily over space. So the west coast of America is dry and the east coast is wet. But that basic fact is crucial, that it's not man-made, but it's crucial for human life. And it has profound effects for water which need to be understood. Water has distinctive emotional and psychological meanings to people. The system for providing water is fragmented. Why? Going back 10,000 years or more to the first cities in Mesopotamia, you could never have a community of people living if there wasn't some sort of water supply near them. And we move forward 10,000 years, and there's cities and towns all over the world, each with their own water system. And the arrangements people make to bring water to themselves endure because they need to endure. And the result is a huge path dependence. Now, economists disapprove of all these things. They are complications, sort of irrelevant complications, and necessary. If an economist was inventing the world today, he would get rid of all those features. This is the point. But they are endemic to water. And so the whole point is we have to adapt economics to that physical reality. whether we like it or not. And so I'm going to illustrate that point with a few topics. And let me start with pricing, because pricing, to economists, everything starts and ends with the pricing of water. If you price water, you get the right usage of water, you get the right allocation among different users, you get the right investment in supply, in capacity planning. Everything falls into place. But the point is, if you set prices to water in a public context, people, if they don't like the prices, they will scream. I mean, they will object. So I had the pleasure of designing water rates for Los Angeles. I'm going to talk about them in a few minutes. And the reaction to those rates was a series of public demonstrations, one of which got 3,000 people. And one of the people stood up, announced he was dying of cancer, but he was prepared to kill himself there and then at this meeting if it would lead to abandoning the iniquitous rates which Professor Hanemann had developed. Fortunately, so we did change the rates, and he didn't kill himself at the occasion. But the point I'm making is, if you want to develop rates, they have to be fair. And they have to, the product that people get for what they pay has to be worth what you're making them to pay. They have to realize they're getting something which justifies paying. And the third point is something that economists don't understand. People will pay money if this is covering a tangible cost. Somebody takes the money and uses it to buy things whose cost amount adds up to what you're paying them. Economists' notion of a shadow price, of a signal of scarcity, doesn't work. Otherwise, you have people threatening to commit suicide. A shadow, if you want to send a signal of scarcity to people, mail a letter. Don't screw around with their prices. And so, as an economist, I understand all about shadow. I understand the logic. I'm just saying it doesn't work, and especially it doesn't work for water. And so you have to find a way to design water prices that are acceptable on these terms. Otherwise, what will happen is a political intervention which will undo the water prices. A high price will influence behavior, but it will get shot down, within a month by a political intervention. And that's unfortunate, but it's how things are. Now, part of this, so the reason why price seems such an attractive instrument is because it seems to deal with two objectives. On the one hand, price influences behavior. On the other hand, it raises money, and water is an extremely expensive commodity to supply. And so we need to raise a lot of money in order to supply water. So you could think, well, you raise money, you influence behavior, you hit two goals with one instrument, wonderful. It often doesn't work that way. If you influence behavior and people use less of the product, you're going to raise less revenue than you hoped. If you don't influence people's behavior at all, you'll raise a lot more revenue, but you won't influence behavior. What I want to argue is you have to separate the two objectives and decide which is most important. And if you want to raise revenue, then price, or some version of price, and I'll come back to this, is important. What I want to argue is if you want to change behavior, there are other things you can do besides price. I'm going to go through a specific example which is very relevant for America and not at all relevant here, which is household water use, outdoor water use for watering lawns, watering gardens. We live in Phoenix, which is arid, gets 8 inches of rain a year. We live near an area with huge gardens, with huge lawns, which probably use 2, 3, 4 feet of water a year. And certainly in many American cities, the time of peak use is summertime, driven by lawn watering. The summer is when you have drought and water shortages. So the summer is when you need to find a way of restricting use. And a natural thing is to raise water rates. And there are a number of studies, including a very well-known study, which found that it used data from 20 cities, it had demand functions, and found that you could solve water shortages by raising water rates during the summertime, different amounts from different cities, but from about 50% up to actually about 200%. And the thrust of this article is how using price raises people's welfare compared to restricting water use and is efficient. If you talk to any water manager and suggest announcing in the spring a 25 or 30% rise in water rates starting 3 months from now, they roll their eyes. I have a colleague now teaching at Phoenix who was the water manager in Phoenix who wanted to raise water rates by 30% to finance a major piece of infrastructure to deal with drought. Raise rates 30% over 2 years. She was almost thrown out of her job for doing this. So if you had to restrict water use, what could you do? Well, what cities do is they explain there's a shortage, they put on advertisements, and then they impose some limit on outdoor watering, 2 days a week or 3 days a week or 1 day a week or whatever. What they're doing is imposing a quantity constraint, not a price constraint. And it works, and I believe I'm tempted to do this. If you surveyed households and you asked, would you prefer to have the price of water jacked up, 50% over the summer, or would you prefer to have a restriction on outdoor watering? I don't believe that the public would, that there'd be any sign that they'd find greater welfare with a price increase than, right? So what's going on? Well, economists, The standard argument is that the economists assume people are making careful decisions how much of a commodity to use. So if a household waters 3 times a week or whatever, that's because the household thinks that's the optimal amount to use. Using less water, would be worth the cost of the extra watering and so on. Very simply, there's no evidence for this. There's no evidence of outdoor use. Surveys have shown that most people have no idea how much water they're using for lawn watering. And secondly, there's an incredible variation with maybe 30% of households underwatering drastically and maybe in 40% or more overwatering drastically. And the amount of water per inches per acre for a given relative to what would be agronomically optimal, the amount of water applied varies from like 5% of what's optimal to 300%. So, but water. Here's the thing: we use water many times during the day for our lives. Nobody sets out on January the 1st and says, I'm going to use 120 acre-feet this month. It's not a truth. And so economists' notion that you're consciously choosing a total of water is false. I mean, just because that's not how we use water. And so the argument that if you don't use price, you are violating consumer sovereignty and you are violating careful, conscious choices made by households is wrong. Now, if we were talking about industry, certain types of industry, sure, if they use 1,000 gallons this week, they have chosen that. They know what they're doing, and they didn't want to use 1,100. They didn't want to use 900. But what I'm saying is different users are making choices about water in different ways. But the other thing, more basic, is rationing water in a shortage on price is like rationing blood on the basis of price. It's essential for human life. Why is it reasonable to ration based on price? There are a couple more issues with price that I want to mention. What is the cost of delivering water? Well, labor is one of the largest expenditures. Labor is a fixed cost, not a variable cost. We've studied several hundred water utilities in California, and between 2013 and 2015, they dropped water deliveries by 20 to 30 to 35%. There was no change in the labor force, in the number of hours paid. The only variable inputs are power to pump water, chemicals if you treat water, and purchasing water if you buy water and if you are paying by quantity as opposed to having a fixed purchase contract. If you have a fixed purchase contract, water is no longer a variable cost. And when you factor this in, and I and my colleague Mehdi Namati at the UC Riverside, most water supply systems, the variable cost, the marginal cost, is between 10 and 30% of the cost. And so if you were going to price marginal cost, you wouldn't at all cover the cost of operations. Why is the variable cost so low? Because most of water is fixed cost. So water isn't manufactured, of course not. We have to collect it. We have to bring it from Northern California to Southern California. We have to store it for use over the summer. We have to treat it, and then we have to deliver it through hundreds of miles of pipes. That's all a fixed cost. Another thing which is not recognized is the rate of capacity utilization in a networked supply system is phenomenally low compared to what we think of manufacturing. The water infrastructure, collecting it, storing it, delivering it, treating it, has to handle the peak hourly demand. But the ratio of average daily demand to peak hourly demand is peak hourly demand may be 3 or 4 times. And then you have firefighting, which requires extra capacity. So most days of the year, you are only using 25% of the capacity of your infrastructure. And also the infrastructure has economies of scale. So you can't say, well, I'll put in a 20-inch pipe main. And then 15 years from now, I'll expand it to a 24-inch pipe. That doesn't work. So we use a small fraction of our infrastructure, and that contributes to the high capital cost. And then the other thing is, much of the infrastructure lasts 80, 100, 120 years. We have to pay for all of that up front, or we have to finance it all up front before we can deliver a single drop from the source to this household with a pipe. But it's going to stick around, for 80 or 100 years. And so that's one thing. The second thing is the infrastructure is not a private good. It's a public good. It's non-rival. If I use the pipe down our street, you can use it. And if there's water flowing, it's non-excludable. If how you allocate the price of a public good to individual users for individual quantities of use, basically there's no real solution. And so now with electricity, it's different. Sure, if there's a shortage of electricity, you need a price signal, so the utility goes out and gets an extra gas generator, and it puts it in service, and it generates more kilowatts, or it buys power on the grid from some other city. Water isn't electricity. It's not man-made. And the cost structure is so unforgiving. So I'm arguing for a change in focus. We need to think of managing the quantity and allocating the quantity. And I want to very quickly describe my experience, which came about purely by chance in designing water rates for Los Angeles. The rate we designed after the guy threatened to kill himself, we changed the rates, and we wound up with, I think, a rate structure that is desirable and very simple. It consisted of 2 blocks. You paid a lower price up to a certain quantity, and then beyond that, you paid a higher price. But depending upon your circumstances, so the lower price was the same for everybody, the higher price. What differed was the switch point, where you switched from the lower price to the higher price. And the switch point was an allocation to you of how much cheap water you would get. And we divided LA's water supplies into kind of existing water supplies, and then where future water was going to come in the event of a shortage. And it was wastewater treatment, not potable reuse, but secondary reuse. And the idea was the city has so much water, and there's so many people in the city. Some of it is cheap, but otherwise it's going to be expensive. And the notion is, let's divide the cheap water fairly among all the people in the city based on their circumstances, based on the size of the yard lot. Outdoor lawn watering was the dominant factor, based on the climate zone. Was it hot? Was it cool? Let's divide up the cheap water fairly. And then if you want to use more, you can, but you're using the expensive water. And that's the second block. And we used basically average cost pricing because we wanted to be revenue neutral. We didn't want to. But the whole thing is we were allocating the existing water fairly among people. This was it involved price, of course, but what was important was the quantity allocation and price. And I'll mention a second thing is we wanted the incentive of the higher price to be targeted at kind of discretionary uses. And we had that in mind when we determined the switch point from one block to another, because it was based on what was the sort of reasonably efficient usage for people in their circumstances. I want to say a word. A growing issue is groundwater depletion, and the issue of using price. So farmers are using water, and the issue is, should we price groundwater to control depletion? Would it work? There have been about half a dozen studies in the last 5, 6, 7 years showing places which raised the price of groundwater, and groundwater pumping went down 20, 22, 25%. And the New York Times ran an article, this is kind of the way to go to manage groundwater overdraft, raise prices. I was involved in one of the studies, and I read the others. I don't believe price was responsible for the reduction in groundwater pumping. These were all cases where groundwater pumping was a political problem at the state level. The groundwater pumping was dewatering an endangered aquifer or a river that was an interstate, subject to an interstate compact. And the groundwater pumping was leaving less water in the river flowing into the downriver state, and the downriver state was threatening to sue the upriver state. And that's why the political leadership of the upriver state had to intervene. And the water users knew that. How did they come about with a higher price? They were spending money subsidizing things that would reduce groundwater pumping. So the price wasn't set because it was believed that that price would lead to a 22% reduction. A lower price would lead to a smaller reduction. No, the agencies needed to raise money for the expenditures they were making, and they raised money for that reason. It wasn't calibrated to reduce pumping. The groundwater pumping was lowered because everybody knew the governor would intervene and to limit groundwater pumping if they didn't do anything. So I don't believe that the reduction in pumping was triggered by price. There are also some other cases where there was similar political pressure and the farmers just reduced pumping. There wasn't any price, they're just reducing pumping. There are two reasons why I believe this. One is if you look at the history, you see the threat of political intervention. The other is if you look at the farm costs, which economists tend not to do. These were places where the cost of water was less than 10% of the cost of production. So if they reduced water use by 20%, they were lowering the cost of production by 2%. And if you think that was big enough to motivate a change, I don't buy it. Now, very quickly, I want to say a few things about water markets, and then I'll wrap up. So water is variable over time. So water markets seem natural. It's variable over space. It's raining a lot here. It's dry where you are. I've got more water than I need. You're short this year, so why don't I sell some water? Why do we use markets to reallocate water? Again, if this were electricity, that's not a problem. I have surplus generating capacity here. You're short. I'm going to sell water, and you pay me the cost of generating. But we're not manufacturing water. And so the argument that markets are desirable is a good one in theory, but it's more complicated in practice. So a couple of points. One is we need to distinguish between short-term markets, leasing at times of scarcity, versus markets as an instrument of long-run reallocation. Why do you need long-run reallocation? Well, you have population growth. You have shifts from agrarian to urban societies. You have climate change. And so places which didn't need water in the last century, or whatever, will need it this century. So you need long-run reallocation. That's different from, this is a dry year for me. I need some extra water, but normally I don't need it. This is different from the short-run water marketing. Much of the economic literature ignores that distinction simply because they do a one-year analysis. And so you don't know, is this 1 year, out of 20 years in a row? Or is this 1 year that occurs every 10 or 15 years? So what I'm saying is short-term leasing is economically beneficial. Long-run permanent sales that give a permanent reallocation is economically efficient, but they're two different phenomena and two different types of benefits. What happens in the United States is mostly short-term leases. It's not long-run leases. It's not permanent transfers. I've been studying that with my students for the last 4 years. There are two, and I've been studying the permanent transfer. There are two key things we find. One, in the economics literature, the assumption is water users make fine-grained adjustments. Should I grow 10% less corn this year and sell the water, or should I keep the corn acreage? What actually happens is not incremental adjustments. When farmers sell, they sell half their water, 3/4. They are getting out of farming, or they're reducing the scale of farming. They're not making incremental adjustments. And secondly, when they sell, it's basically not determined by the price of water in the market. So I have studied this water market in Colorado. The price was a few $100s in 1970. It was $5,000 in the early 1980s. It then went down. In 2010, it was $10,000. It hit $90,000, 90, in 2019. These are enormous price changes. But when people sold, I have the complete list of ownership every year, as well as the list of who sold and when. And what I find, and this is what the water brokers will tell you, is people sell mainly because of the 3 Ds: death, divorce, or debt. They have a big debt, they need to raise a ton of money quickly, and the other thing is they want to relocate. They no longer want to farm here, land is expensive or whatever, they want to move elsewhere. And so one other thing, there's a lot of information here. Let me just summarize it. The property rights to water. Two distinctions. You read about appropriative rights in the American West, invented in California, then adopted in all the 15 or so other Western states. And there's a whole lot of business, seniority. It's fascinating. You read law books. That doesn't affect most water use. Most water use is supplied by water supply organizations, irrigation districts of some form. The districts own the water rights. You're served by a district. You don't own, in most cases, you don't own anything. If you own right in this district, you have the right to be served. You don't own any water. The district owns the water. Most of the water users don't own anything they can sell. They own stuff they can lease. How do we lease? I phone the district and I say, next month, I don't need water. Deliver my water to Mary. And then Mary pays me money off the side, which the district doesn't know. That's how leasing goes. It doesn't go through the district. It's off the books. Where leasing occurs is where water districts that are part of a wholesale network exchange water with one another. But the leasing is between water districts, not individual users, and it's between water districts within a connected network. And there are lots of connected networks. So the actual nature of water markets is very fragmented. There are 20,000 irrigation water rights in California. Those 20,000 are not farmers trading. Most of them are water supply districts. Most water supply districts don't sell their water rights permanently unless so much land has gone out of production. The other thing is, what you own if you have an appropriative right is still complicated in Western states. If the appropriative right has not been validated, the appropriative rights are based on a quantity of water and a seniority. And many of these are historical rights with no written record of the quantity or the seniority. If these have not been validated, you don't actually own anything specific that you can sell. The way the laws have been developed in Western states is you can lease for a year at a time without proving the seniority or the quantity. If you use that amount of water for 5 years in a row, you can lease that quantity. You don't have to prove that in 1875, when someone first diverted, he was using that amount. So the actual quantity that you own is obscure if it hasn't been adjudicated, and most of the water rights haven't been adjudicated because that's a long, years long, decades long, an expensive legal process. In addition to that, there's the doctrine of no injury, that if I sell water to you, anybody else can complain that if this causes a change in stream flow, they are injured by the change in stream flow. And it doesn't matter if they're junior to me and you or not. You're not allowed to change stream flow. And since, the location of water use and where it returns is specific, that's a big complication. Again, that restriction is waived basically for leases. And then there are other factors which limit the state's right, where the state has a right to limit your use of water, far more so than for land. So the result is, even if you have an appropriative right, what looks like a property right, what you own with water is much more nebulous than if you own land. And the result is permanent sales of water, which are needed, I believe, to deal with climate change, happen very rarely. They're not a powerful tool. Now, they could be if you change the laws of water rights. And so many of my economist colleagues, some of them who started at UC the same time I did, have said, stop talking about changing water. Changing property rights to water is politically impossible. This is the point. People have tried and failed in California repeatedly. And so some of my colleagues have said, let's have water markets and not waste time trying to change property rights. You can't have a meaningful water market if what you're selling is a nebulous quantity and a nebulous right. So you can have lease markets, but you can't have, or where you have permanent sales is only where the property rights are really solid. Now, there's another example, and this is the last thing I want to talk about, and it happens to, I've experienced this in my current work on the Colorado River, on Arizona, and it happens to intersect with the theme of the conference we've just had, the workshop, of water credits. And my experience in these two cases, I'll explain, has led me to be skeptical of water credits. And there are reasons, there are cases where water credits become counterproductive. And that is the negative experience in America. I'm going to describe the Colorado River as an example. But I agree in other circumstances, the Colorado water credits are a very good thing. So these are cases where water users voluntarily use less water, either through conservation or in one case, or maybe using reclaimed wastewater, and they get a credit for the surface water they would have used. Well, let me lead. So what I'm saying here is the property rights schemes we have in America and in other countries are counterproductive. They lock things in place. They lock water in place. They lock water in place based on past stream flow, and we now have a different hydrology. And it's like complain to Mother Nature, but you better adapt to nature because you can't tough it out. And so but making short-run fixes is certainly simpler than changing property rights. Making incremental small changes as a workaround. The classic example is the Colorado River. There are 7 states that border the Colorado River. The use of Colorado River began around 1900, 1890. The largest users at first were California, Imperial Valley. And and then parts of Arizona. The other states were worried that these two users, especially California, would claim rights to most of the Colorado River water because they were the largest users. They were using maybe 35, 40, 45% of the diversions at that time. And so the states got together and very laboriously reached an agreement in 1922, dividing up the river among the 7 states. The amount of water, so I'm going to use Anglo-Saxon units, not metric units, apologies. They divided up 18 million acre-feet. And the way they divided it was they allocated 15 million acre-feet among themselves. So there's the upper basin is 4 states, and then California, Nevada, and Arizona are 3 states. They divided 15 million equally, 7.5 to the upper basin and the lower basin. They reserved some water, which subsequently turned out to be 1.5 million acre-feet for Mexico, because the river, of course, runs out. They ignored evaporation, but evaporation occurs. And evaporation is about 1.5 million. So they were dividing up, if you recognize that evaporation occurs, they were dividing up 18 million. It was a small problem. There wasn't 18 million acre-feet in the river. During the 20th century, the actual stream flow was about 15 million acre-feet. Now, the water actually being used through the end of the 20th century was about 14.5 or 15 million acre-feet, because the upper basin states were using just over half of their allocation. And the lower basin states used a bit more, whatever was there. It was by 2000 that the problem, because Arizona, which has a share 2.8 million, wasn't able to take its full water until the federal government built a canal, the Central Arizona Project, which started delivering water in the early 90s. And then it was clear that all of the stream flow that was there was actually being used. But climate change was kicking in. There was a drought between 2000 and 2004. The stream flow since 2000 to the present is 12.5. Now, we have been using the 7 states, and then Mexico, and then we've been using 15 million, 14.5. Over 20 years, there's only been 12.5 each year. The reservoirs were full in 2000, as it happens. They almost crashed, became empty in 2022. Because we allocated more water than there is in the river. It's as simple as that. So what to do? Well, the signs of shortage, were looming. There was the drought in 2000 to 2004. And the 7 states started negotiating among themselves. So a key thing, the federal government really stood on the sidelines. It operates the dams, but the whole history is the states negotiate among themselves. So by the early 2000s, it was clear that there might not be enough water. The states worked out an agreement in 2007. Some of the states, they did 2 things. They reached an agreement that if there was a shortage roughly of up to 1 million acre-feet, the lower basin would take the shortage, primarily Arizona, then New Mexico, and in the very last resort, California. But they started an agreement for voluntary conservation. Intentionally created surplus, and they could get credit. That would leave water stored in the reservoirs, and the states, the users that stored the water could get credit when there was a shortage. So they set up a mechanism. these arrangements for voluntary conservation, intentionally created surplus, were sort of expanded. Then there was a scare in 2015, a drought scare, and the agreements were sort of expanded in 2019. And in 2021, the first cutback in deliveries under the agreements that had been made was imposed. All of these agreements were set to expire at the end of 2026, basically 25 years after the initial version of an agreement in 2029. Well, it is now 2026. And the way things work, there has to be a decision by this spring because the federal government has to make plans to operate the reservoirs. It has to announce its plans by June or some date like that. And the states have been in negotiation but can't reach agreement. And so here's the basic choice the states face now. Or there are two views. One is, let's extend voluntary conservation, but we leave the 18 million acre-feet allocated. We don't reopen that negotiation. An incremental change, and let's get water credits. My view as an outsider, an academic living in the academia, this is crazy. The stream flow is only going down. We have a stream flow of 12.5. We're using 15. We don't have 15, and 20 or 30 years from now, the stream flow may be 10. Who thinks it'll be easier to change the compact? Obviously, we should go to a proportional sharing, but we need to renegotiate that. And what I'm arguing is voluntary water credits are going to become counterproductive. At some point, we'll have to bite the bullet and change things. And I'm reminded of a quotation attributed, apparently it's apocryphal, attributed to Winston Churchill. And Winston Churchill was reflecting at the end, after World War II, on how England got through. And what he said is, you can always trust the Americans to do the right thing after they have explored every other alternative. And, with the Colorado River, with renegotiating the compact, we will probably explore every other alternative for God knows how many decades before we do the right thing. And that's my concern, where you have voluntary credits as a substitute for fixing property rights that are out of whack. Now, there's another example I'm going to skip. Let me just say this. One of the speakers yesterday referred to the distinctive features of water management in Singapore. And he mentioned 3 factors, and I'm adding a 4th. The government of Singapore was willing to make deliberate choices and hard choices. It had strong institutions, and I'm adding, and it also had integrated management, and it had a long-term commitment. Those are exactly the things lacking in the United States. No long-term commitment, short-term thinking. No integration. California has maybe 2,000 water management agencies, wholesale, retail, none of them the state government. Some wastewater, some capacity planning. China, the reference was, I think, 1 dragon for water. Well, we have 2,000 dragons in California. And so that's why, actually, I feel tremendously upbeat after having the privilege of attending the workshop. It is wonderful. It is refreshing to see some places that can escape from history and do things right. I only wish we could. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Hanemann, for the very insightful talk, sharing his rich experience of, working on water issues. So now is the audience Q&A time. Anyone wants to start the ball?
Hi, Professor. So by way of introduction, I'm not really a student here. I just got out of my military conscription last Friday, and I thought this talk's quite interesting. But anyway, I thank you for the lecture. Please correct me if I'm wrong. My understanding so far is that prices are maybe not the best way to police water usage, simply because dollar votes don't adequately reflect the political realities of using water. And I was wondering what happens if we start to view these property rights for water as a form of currency of belonging to these water districts. Because again, when I think of the history of the West Coast, there is a certain measure of manifest destiny in terms of laying claim to property and in terms of using water. And apart from residential usage, there was a fair bit of industrial usage, especially after World War II. So is it possible that it's because of this competition between differing currencies of water and, a lack of fair competition with fair information in the market for water that's causing these inefficiencies in allocation?
It's more than that. So, for example, cities never sell water. Because they dream there will be growth, they stockpile water right. Irrigation districts don't sell water unless the farmers go away and land is retired and they can't sell the water. So there's not a... and I mentioned, farmers sell water when they're ready to stop farming. So price signals don't actually move water around. They do in the lease market, if it's a dry year versus if it's a wet year. But prices don't actually move water around. In some cases, industrial users, yes, they're very much responsive to price. But a large chunk of users, for various reasons, aren't responsive. I mean, there's a simple reason. I'm a water user. If I sell half my water this year, what am I going to do? It only makes sense if I want to change my job or change the location of my job. And so... you see, so on the one hand, water use is not responsive to price the way economists assume. That's the first thing. It would be responsible to massively high prices, sure. But politically, you can't impose massively high prices. There will be an intervention. And so within the range in which we can set prices are, in many cases, not for everybody, but in many, are not a useful tool. And then, because we can't manufacture water, so if there's a shortage, getting people to use less water, not by price, but by restricting it. And the block rates are a sort of price, but they're kind of saying you get this much. And if you want to use more, sure. But then you have to buy the expensive water. So it is using price, but it's also this notion of you got this allocation and that's of the cheap water and that's fair. And what I'm getting is we have to think of quantity allocations, not entirely separate from price, but rather price in conjunction with quantity allocations. That's the key.
Jialing is here and from NTU ISS. Question is, in your view, what's the most, it is assumption about rational behavior or is treatment of water as an economic good or its ability to capture social or ecosystem values? Thank you.
Where economics goes wrong is when it makes assumptions that are wrong. And the problem with when you learn when I teach economics, you have to try and understand which assumptions are right and which are wrong, and therefore you shouldn't believe the conclusion. This is the key thing. So, for example, rationality. I don't believe in a household demand function per se. I believe in because I don't think anybody gets up and decides, I'm going to use X acre feet this week or this month. You decide, I'm going to take a shower, I'm going to take a bath, I'm going to drink a glass of water, etc. So the mistake their economists are making is they're making a choice which they're not making. They're making, and the arguments of efficiency, as I say, economists know that water costs that they get, but they don't realize that those costs are collecting water, not manufacturing it. And if there is not physical molecules of water, two things. The cost is infinite, but the other thing is the real issue is a fair allocation. And fairness matters precisely because as human beings, we die if we don't get water for 4 days on end. It's as simple as that. So it's more economists don't realize the specific, if you like, the landscape of water has contours, it has hills and valleys. It's not just a flat plane. And you can do economic analysis, but once you make the assumptions fit, what's going on, what people care about. The issue is not are people rational or irrational. The issue is what choices are people making and what things are they not choosing, they're doing habitually. And economists sort of frame everything as a simple rational choice. But the set of choices consumers make, is on the one hand abundant, and big chunks of behavior are done from habit or whatever, and that's fine. So you have to be more selective in using economics and in thinking economics. And that needs to be explained because the economics textbooks that exist now don't do that. They're the standard kind of Homo economicus. But the Homo economicus, the humans that exist are more complicated.
Professor, thank you very much for the lecture. What an honor to see you in person and to hear from you. I work on the intersection between behavioral economics and water use. So I agree entirely with almost what you said, entirely, except for maybe 2%. So I'm going to ask you about the 2%. It's about water 1 and water 2, the cheap water and the slightly less cheap water. And you think, and it's, you've said a few times that if you allocate water 1 fairly across everybody, and then water 2 you can load on more expensive. And you define fairly as according to the size of your lawn, for example. Is that how you define fair?
So that was a complicated process, and there was a blue ribbon committee, and I was reporting to the committee. So in the end, the committee adopted the rates, and then the water commissioners adopted the rates, and then the city council adopted the rates. So I was looking for something that was acceptable to them, and there are different ways of doing things. So I'm not, the details are not unique, but what we did was we identified different lot sizes, which is,
I did.
And then I got agronomic information. So then I made estimates of reasonable indoor use and reasonable outdoor use, given the lot size, given the climate.
Right.
So that was how I did it, and you could.
No, I understood that. I wasn't going to sort of disagree on the empirics to say, I was going to ask, did you think that, how about an alternative idea of what's fair? If you were rich, you didn't get any water 1. If you were poor, you got water 1. So I wonder whether some means testing
I understand nobody in city government in the water was willing to go there. And one issue we discussed was household size. And the city said, we don't have data on household size. We have 400,000 residential accounts, and we don't know that. So they set up a system where you got an allowance, but if you appealed to the city and showed you had more than, I think, 4 people, you could get an adjustment based on household size, but you had to bring the data. I think doing it on income would not have flown. Again, I'm a believer in behavioral economics, but the decision makers was the blue ribbon panel and those, and it's like what they would go along with and what they wouldn't was the crucial constraint.
Would you?
I would have given some thought to that. You know, the EPA has a standard of what the expenditure on water and sanitation shouldn't be more than 4 or 5% of income, and so I might have looked at on those lines.
Professor, my name is Helena Chu. I'm from Graces in Life. I offer holistic perspective and alternative perspective wherever I go. So here's my question. Given that water is a basic necessity for human dignity, and it's also the responsibility of the politicians, the government, the people governing the countries to provide water. Yeah. When we see water as a commodity, we debate over the economics behind water and its scarcity, when water is actually in abundance. Instead of financial economics, may I offer you a holistic ecosystem perspective of harvesting, desalinating, as well as collecting water?
So, California, San Diego does desalinate seawater. It costs 3.5 times as much as river water. And it actually caused a political crisis in San Diego County, which runs this, because water rates, wholesale water rates have tripled in 12 years, between 2010 and 14 years, but they started tripling. And some cities, actually small towns with agricultural uses, where people were growing avocados with city water, which is extremely, complained against the desal because it was too expensive. So that's the first point I want to make. California is the only state in America which declared a human right to water. It did it, I think, 11 or 12 years ago. It is still working to find the financing to make water available, especially in small rural areas or in small towns with failing water systems. And so what I want to say is, I believe in a human right. The problem is who, and this is the issue with water, it is so expensive. It is so capital intensive, so you have to it's not just expensive, it has to be financed up front. You can't do pay as you go. You can't make the users. You're paying now for infrastructure, which is going to be around 70, 80 years. And the problem with water is who is going to come up with the money now? And I would be happy, personally, to pay higher taxes. But that's not how taxes play out in California. The third point I want to make is what has emerged as a better solution than desal is potable reuse. Now, potable reuse has just started last year in California and is expanding after really nothing ever. California was talking about reuse when I came in the 1976. It is now doing something. It is less expensive than desal, but still very expensive. What's great about potable reuse is occurring. It's not being driven for water supply. It's being driven by sanitation agencies that have overloaded sewers and overloaded treatment plants who don't want to spend the money to expand their sewers or to build new treatment plants. We have a wastewater treatment dragon in the county, and then we have several hundred water supply dragons, and the dragons don't talk to one another, so it wasn't integrated. But it can be in the future. So I'm saying the expansion of wastewater treatment had nothing to do with water supply. But if you want more water, and we will, that is a better solution than seawater desal for two reasons. You don't have the environmental effects of discharging the brine, but also you can make the sewage users contribute to the cost. So so you can cap the cost to the water users. And so what is going to happen is not so much desal in many areas, but wastewater. The problem is the cost. The problem, and one last point on this, water pricing is decided. So water utilities make long-run capital plans. They make pricing decisions often on a 1-year decision, at most on a 3 or 4 year decisions. They make capital investments, which are going to be. San Diego County has $20 billion of debt. It makes its water rates year by year. The member agencies are free each year to take water or not take water. The member agencies elect the board of directors. The board of directors decides by a majority to undertake, a $5 billion investment. None of the member agencies make any commitment to buy the water. The rates literally are set each year, and each year member agencies can decide how much. So it's that fragmentation among agencies and between wastewater and water supply, fragmentation between the capital investment planning and the water rate planning. It's that fragmentation which generates this dysfunctional system, with which I was comparing Singapore. But you try and combine 2 water agencies. So San Diego is now discussing the wholesale agency has $20 billion in debt. It makes rates one by one. It's going bankrupt because with conservation, with drought, and with the use of potable reuse, the amount of water it sold has fallen by 40%, is going to fall by another 20%. Its costs are fixed costs. It's facing, it won't go, well, so there are 2 suggestions being discussed. One is break up the county wholesaler into 3 smaller regional wholesalers, and they will deal better with the individual member agencies. The other proposal, more radical, is have one agency which does retail and wholesale in the county. To use a phrase, one water dragon. That will be politically opposed. Everybody wants their water system, and they don't want to give up their water system. So it's these structural features which are problematic.
My name is Leon. This is my first year in the U.S. I spent past 15 years in the United States. And I work in the public-private sectors. Most recently, the past 4 years, I was in LA doing building material distribution. I want to share interesting finding with you. So my business covers like plumbing supplies, HVAC supplies, and both utility companies have their own rebate program. So for HVAC, it's like certain SEER ratings. We give you $500, $1,000 rebate on that to save your upfront costs. For water is, if you want to convert your yard to a turf grass, they're going to give you $5 per square foot. So the result is, if I'm rich enough to have a yard to water, I don't care about the money to make it to more water saving. And another thing is we work with developer a lot, right? Every single developer walk into my store going to ask, like, what is the most efficient HVAC? They're going to pay a premium for that because they know that it's guaranteed. It's a saving for developer, for investor, and for users. When it comes to like faucet, toilet, I don't care. Give me the cheapest, most water intense options out there. I don't like slow. I don't want a slow, like low pressure. I don't want slow flow. I don't want anything like that because you're saying this just have a direct impact on the user experience per se. And that's like, they never change the mentality. People always think like US, our average water is 5 times the global average. And we have plenty of waters. We have everywhere. And when I work in the public sector, water is always like, oh, someone want to build a factory for business attractions? Great, we have a lake. And the cost is 0. I don't care. It's just $0 bonus. If you want more water, fine, take it. So this brings to my question is, With the growing demand of data center, they consume tons of electricity, but at the same time, the older technology using chillers use a lot of water. And given all this conventional economics, like, do you think there will be a reasonable, creative financing tools to kind of like solve the problem? I mean, like, this economics probably not work, but do you think financing gonna punish or reward people moving forward?
I appreciate what you're saying. So all of these water agents, the state of California, so investor-owned utilities are regulated by the Public Utility Commission, but 85% of the water comes from publics, not investor-owned, and they're not regulated at all in California. I mean, the health stuff is regulated, but there's no economic regulation by the state. The state need not exist. It's all at the level of local government. So I could say, well, is that how it's done in Singapore? That's what. So what I have advocated, but it is the state of California should set up a commission looking at the future investment needs for water, either urban water or both urban and irrigation in California. Now, I'm sorry? It regulates investor-owned, but investor-owned is the unimportant part. Yes, that's the thing. So my scenario is the state should set up a commission to examine, what's the state of our infrastructure, what investment do we need, and how should we pay for it? And what I'm getting at is this. The Public Utility Commission, which regulates investors, that system works. It mandates rates. It mandates good rate structures. The regulated utilities, of course, the customers complain. The regulated utilities have political cover. They say the PUC mandated the problem with the municipal sector is there's no political cover. Each system has a city council or a board, and if the state did what I'm thinking, it could then lay out pricing guidelines. It wouldn't regulate prices, but it could provide the political cover that we need to raise rates because municipalities need to raise X dollars in capital, and also, we need to do X with data centers and other things. So the state would have the moral authority to step in. It would have the legal authority, but I'm saying it wouldn't have to regulate. It could give political cover. There are 400 major urban water systems in California, some like LA big, something small. They're each vulnerable, to their voters and the city council. And so I see this as a gap where the city government is silent, the governor. And that's the missing piece. It wouldn't be a monster. It wouldn't be a dragon. But, it would be like a paper dragon, a shadow of a dragon. And so we need something to make salient the issue, make the issue salient and also kind of provide guidance. Because otherwise each city is vulnerable to its own critics.
Thank you so much for the robust discussion. Let's thank Professor Hanemann. All right, thank you. We have reached the end of the lecture.